Okay, so here's your first example of yin and yang, even on our panel. Chloe is so steady and very calm. You'll see very shortly that I'm going to be all over the place, so just warning you now. We were invited to respond to various questions, and so my presentation, I'm going to be addressing 3 questions, and it may seem a little bit disjointed, but it's because we had a certain sequence in mind initially. So the 3 questions that I will address are, 1, why is it important to have Asian American approaches to biblical interpretation? 2, why do people seem to resist alternate approaches to the Bible? And 3, how might the church benefit? So Chloe addressed how does the academy benefit, and I will address how the church might benefit from Asian American perspectives. So again, it's the importance, 2nd, resistance, and then 3rd, how the church might benefit. So the first question, why is it important to have Asian American approaches to biblical interpretation? For me, the most important reason, it's a matter of identity. Let me begin with a few personal reflections. More so in my adult years, but throughout my life, I always wondered why I had a problem understanding why I didn't fit identity development models that I was learning in school. According to Erik Erikson, by my early 20s, I was supposed to have identity developed, and here I was in my mid-20s, 30s, approaching 40, and I still hadn't identity developed. And so I thought, okay, there must be something wrong with me because they're the experts, they should know. James Marcia, another identity developmentalist, says that I am foreclosed because I am taking too much into consideration what my parents wanted for me in my future and my future career, my future path. I also felt a pressure to be monovocal, or the way Erik Erikson talks about it is having self-sameness. No matter where you go, you are always the same. I can never be that way, and I always felt like I had to choose between my many voices. Let me give you some example of some of these voices. When I'm with my students, I have one voice. When I was on the church board, I had another voice. When I'm with my colleagues, I have another voice. And when I'm with my mother-in-law, you better believe I have another voice. She's actually a very, very reasonable woman. My husband is right here, so I must say that. The problem was I always felt that I was being duplicitous, that I wasn't being genuine in all of these different contexts. I was assertive. My assertive voice came out when I was a theological resource for my students or at the church. But then I could also draw from my well of charm when I was with my former professors, who are now my colleagues, because they were having some difficulty with the transition, my transition of becoming from student to their colleague. But after finding Asian American identity developmentalists, I finally recognized that my multivocality is how I'm now calling it now, my multivocality, or my ability to shift self, or to code switch, as it's been called in other places, is a way to honor those in my various contexts. It's a way to show immense care for my neighbor by putting them at ease, by allowing them to save face. So as I reflected on some stories in the Bible, I recognized that my own story mirrored Ruth's story. And I have now come to name my own identity as Ruth understood her many voices. Now I welcome all those voices of my identity as an integrated whole. It's kind of a both and. Not either or. I'm yin and yang. So I come back to the original question. Why is it important then to have Asian American approaches to biblical interpretation? Again, the most important reason is it's a reason of identity. Because what happens if we don't name those approaches? We end up defaulting to the standard way or the Christian way of interpreting, as if there is a pure Christian way. And sometimes those ways don't align, and we've inherited those ways from our Western forefathers. And those ways don't often align with our Asian American ways of being. And then when we don't experience alignment, what happens? We default yet again to, we've heard it already, the biblical or the Christian trumping the cultural. Well, what if who I am culturally colors my understanding of who God is? Me as an ethnic minority, but I also would argue that the white majority, their ethnic identity and their cultural identity colors who they understand about God. So what if we considered, instead of the Christian or the biblical trumping the cultural, what if we considered that the cultural informs the biblical or the Christian? Identity, that's the key. A colleague once said, if you don't name your own identity, someone else will do it for you. A second reason why it is important to have Asian American approaches to biblical interpretation is in doing so, we contribute to a more complete vision of God and God's basileia, and that's the Greek term. I'm trying to not genderize God's kingdom. We help the larger Christian community see other sides of God. So let me give you an example. I teach a 100-level Old Testament course, and in that course I regularly provide the opportunities for my international students, many of whom are Asian, to educate the non-international students on many issues, such as Isaac fulfilling the role of hyoja. It's a Korean word to represents good son. So in the story of Abraham's faith being tested and how he had to sacrifice his son Isaac, Isaac is acting as a good son there. Or to educate the non-international students about Jesus' hyodo, or filial piety, in the garden. And inevitably, my non-international students will ask, Professor, what is filial piety? There's really no, even though those are English words, they can't quite understand what filial piety is because they haven't really lived it. So I have to give them an example, and this is the example that I give them. My living with my parents until I was well into my 30s, because I wasn't married yet, and abiding by their midnight curfew. So I was well into my 30s, and I was having to come home by midnight. I know, what was I thinking? I'm Asian American, okay. So that is an example of filial piety. That kind of obedience, the obedience that no matter what, you just do it because that's your role as the child. Bottom line, Western ways of being miss the filial obedience that's in the Bible. Isaac is not mute in that story, folks. He's not mute. He's not a non-character and just a filler. He is a very active character in that story, but what he's doing is he's fulfilling his role as the good son. Our communities, our Asian American communities must deepen the West's sometimes superficial sense of obedience that is in the Bible. Okay, I'm going to move to question 2. What are some reasons that there is resistance to alternate approaches to the Bible? Since my own commitment, since I've committed myself to what they call contextual global approaches to the Bible, I've heard many different kinds of forms of resistance. But the most stubborn of those reasons comes in many forms, but basically it boils down to guilt by association. And we've all heard different versions of this. Ultimately what it is anything that even approaches or even hints at challenging the accepted notions, it's rejected outright because we don't want to be associated with that guilt with that label. On the flip side, anything uncritical and even sometimes harmful or hurtful assertions will be considered as sacred if they can claim some kind of scriptural reference. It's basically proof texting. An important example of this is of this not wanting to be associated with guilt. And it was alluded to yesterday in the early 1900s, liberal Protestantism, and then again in the 1970s and 80s with the emergence of liberation theologies. And I'm already feeling kind of the pushback, liberation theologies. Oh no, she's talking anathema. They give me some leeway a little bit here for a second. When those started to come out, the conservative wings of the church did not want to be associated with anything that was called liberal or liberation. So what ended up happening was a really regretful consequence was that we basically threw the baby out with the bathwater. Alternate, yet very conservative and evangelical approaches or perspectives of the biblical stories were thrown out because they were considered tainted by bias and subjectivity. A second reason for resistance is similar, or kind of somewhat related to the first. It's a fear of another label, the postmodern label. The fear, particularly, of the slippery slope of relativism. However, if you talk with somebody like Chloe, or somebody like me, who we have espoused these cultural global approaches, those who promote these approaches, we would be the first to say we are not relativistic. We'd be the first to confess that Jesus Christ is the truth. Yet what has happened with this fear is that it reveals the failure to see that all interpretation is constructed out of a context. Nothing is neutral. Okay, most of us here probably have been to some form of seminary or Bible school, and we've learned probably the inductive Bible study method. And in the inductive Bible study method, we study genre. We study structural outlining. We study cultural historical context. We study traditions, and we study all of those things. And we think that those are pure, it's part of a pure method. But when you think about where those little pieces come from, Noth, Gunkel, von Rad, where do those guys come from? Gerhard von Rad is a German Lutheran whose desire was to bring the Old Testament back into when? A troubled post-World War II German social context. So there is a context there as well. So even the study of genre, though we think of it as being pure, it's not neutral. It's not neutral, folks. All approaches to Scripture are culturally conditioned, even the ones that are considered the Christian standard ways of approaching the Bible. Okay, so the third question. How might the church benefit from hearing Asian American women's perspectives, particularly women's voices? The first is, I don't think there's anybody in this room who would challenge me to say that when I say that women are the backbone of the Asian American church. I see some women smiling, yes! They are your prayer warriors. They are your caregivers. They are your teachers, your worship leaders, your providers of table, fellowship, etc. Out of these roles and out of their experiences can come a huge potential for alternate perspectives and alternate life theologies that we haven't really explored in our churches. That would be a huge benefit to explore those in our Asian American church. The second benefit is a more balanced view of God and God's basileia. Let me share with you a story. It's almost cliche, but you've heard it said that our relationship with our earthly fathers reflects or is reflected in our relationship with our heavenly Father. That's true in my case. My father was, growing up, a very strict disciplinarian. If we did something wrong, you would find us in the corner. Okay? or being spanked. Basically, we were, punished that way. And after several hours we would finally get up the gumption, the courage to ask for forgiveness. So it would go something like this: Daddy, I want to apologize. Not necessarily because I really wanted to apologize, but because my feet were hurting so much. This would be my dad's response. Why should I forgive you? You're just going to do it again. Now, before you judge him, as I have many times in the past, understand that it was really his desire for me to change my behavior. And so at some very base level, he was really trying to make me a better person. Although as a young kid, it was hard for me to see that. But so this is the picture of my dad, and I think that it had some impact on how I viewed God. One day, driving home from a meeting with our AAWOL sisters, I was kind of meditating on that picture of God, and I don't know if it was as a result of something that we had talked about, but I gave myself a moment to think about God, but in a way that was outside the box. Now, before you jump to any conclusions about me being heretical, allow me a moment here. The question I asked myself is, what if God was more like my mom? Dun, dun, dun. Okay, this is, and as soon as I said that, as soon as I allowed myself to think that, a bunch of images floated into my mind, and the one that came into clear focus was the kind of interactions that I have with my mom. My mom and I are very, very close. And one of the things that I'm very ashamed of is the way that I interact with my mom when she says something that irritates me. I will typically just lash out at her and just totally snap and just yell at her. And of course I feel immediately very just terrible about that, and I feel so badly that I can't control myself. But immediately, because I feel so bad, I ask her for forgiveness. My mom's reaction is this: it's okay, Debbie. She moves on, the sin is forgotten. Even when I do this repeatedly, over and over and over again, and I feel badly every single time, and even though I struggle with this habitual sin, my mom will always, it's okay, and move on. Okay, I wasn't expecting that. This extravagance, this extravagant love and forgiveness, this is the God that I worship. Sheesh, I did not expect this. It wasn't until I opened my mind to think about God as being more like my mom that I realized I had, up to that point, had a limited sense of God because I had not allowed myself to consider other, if you will, maternal aspects of God. What a great benefit that would be in our churches if we allowed ourselves to do that. Let me end with this. I'm going to, in a short time, I will read a list to you, and I'd like you to, this is going to be the interactive portion. I'm going to read a list to you, and I would like you to consider where in the Bible you might find illustrations of these theologies. And I call them theologies because they're aspects that we learn about God, but they are aspects that we don't necessarily key in on or focus on in our churches or from our pulpits. So I'm going to read this list slowly. And I invite you to close your eyes if it'll help you to focus more on my words. But consider what biblical stories might illustrate these theologies. Okay. Care. Partnership. Fierce maternal protection. Familial loyalty and lingering. Silent survival and victory. Creative and emotional fertility. Multivocality and adaptability. contentment in someone else's success, whole life balance. Were you able to think of some stories? You may open your eyes now. These theologies are found in the voices of Priscilla and Aquila, Hannah, Elizabeth and Mary, Bathsheba, Irit, Ruth, even Jesus. Yet we seldom hear these voices from our pulpits. It is my sincere prayer that we consider seriously the impact that we can make together at the table of the larger Christian community dominated by the West. Together, these are the stories we can bring as a community by welcoming alternate approaches. Thank you.